Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Welcome to the first of the four-part series, which is the final updates in the 2020 Project Orchids. So this is where we've followed the same set of orchids divided up into four separate parts from the start of the year, basically, and done updates through the year. Ending up with this one, the final update. So this will be part one, which is the Oncidium Alliance. At the back of the video at the end, I will put a pop-up to the playlist that contains all the other videos, should you be so inclined to want to go and watch them. But you'll need about a day. Obviously each one averages about half an hour, and there's 4 parts per update, and there's 3 sets of updates, so there's actually a lot of viewing there if you choose to do so. So what we'll be doing in this one, the first part, and the other 3 parts, is we will get the stills out from the start, the first update and the second update, and I'll talk over the progress through the year, and then we'll have a video clip looking at the plant as it is now and discuss whether I achieved my goals, whether the plant's gone backwards, downhill, disappeared altogether in some cases, is no longer with us, ceased to be, fallen off the perch, whatever you want to say. But yeah, some didn't make it throughout the year. And in one case we've had an addition following a loss that wasn't a true loss. Anyway, we'll get to that. So part one is the Oncidium Alliance, so we'll go through these plants one at a time and see how we get on. Okay, first up, Tahition Dancer. Quite a bit of Sotoanum in this, and that shows in the colours on the blooms and the fragrance, both brought forward from the Sotoanum. Although the blooms are quite a bit bigger than Sotoanum, it was chosen really for its fragrance, its colour, and the number of blooms on the spikes. Okay, we're in March at the moment, start of the growing season. This one, at this point, was doing exactly as it should be. It was starting its growing season. So basically the young growths are at the front of the plant. Space was left for those to grow on when it was repotted. So the older part of the plant squashed up round the back and plenty of room to grow round the front. It had a good active root system, and I was looking forward to the next set of blooms, but obviously there was quite a bit of growing left to do as these new growths are young. Right, by the time we got to June, obviously the new growths are pushing on, so you can see they're taking up quite a lot more of the front area of that pot where they've expanded. The base of the growths is starting to get large, so they're pushing away from the main part of the plant. Growing on nicely. They had a little bit of dieback round the back of the plant from the oldest of the leaves. Part of that was due to scale round the base of those pseudobulbs, which was, at this point, this was an ongoing treatment. I was getting at them with cotton wool buds and alcohol. I've got a feeling that they did actually get a systemic spray somewhere in there. But anyway, the new growths weren't affected. They were just growing on nicely, and a good root system, which at this point had almost stopped growing. So it had done its thing, it was plenty big enough for the plant, and it had done well and was pushing on, continuing to do what it should do. And by the time we get to September, effectively the new growths are virtually mature now. So every time I watered, I was desperately looking for spikes, which should have started around this point. Given the size and maturity of the growths now, pseudobulbs showing, all that sort of thing. The only problem I had with this is I had quite a bit of dieback on the roots on the surface of the pot, and that's geared up to heat physically and me not watering it quite as often as perhaps I should. But the main bulk of the root system down in the pot remained fine. It was just the surface roots were drying out. Nonetheless, very pleased with this one's progress. It seems to grow well for me. Not all the Oncidiums do, but this one does. It's a good plant, looks nice, nice green leaves, nice healthy bulbs, and a very reasonable root system. So let's see what it looks like today. Okay, we've come full circle with this one. The expectations were for the new growths to grow on, mature, and produce spikes. And quite honestly, that's exactly what they've done. I normally film new blooms to open, but I've been holding this one deliberately so that it could be part of this video. Mainly because I don't think there's anything else in bloom in the set. So Tahitian dancer blooms, given the Sotoanum background, are quite large. They're very fragrant and they're a gorgeous deep colour. Again, the camera will lighten it slightly, but they are a deep burgundy, red purple sort of colour with a delicate pink lilac-y type tinge around the edge of the lip. Okay, and they can produce branching spikes on a good plant. So what we had was 4 new growths. That's matured, nice bulb, good leaves. One next to it matured, spike, again good leaves. And then one decided to come out tucked around the back there. That one hasn't got quite such a large bulb, but it's not bad, and it's produced a weaker spike as a consequence. And then the final new growth, whoops, bloom's tangled up, was off to the side here. Again, a slightly smaller bulb, but a nice spike nonetheless. Now, as far as roots are concerned, if I can lift this out one-handed, I will try. It's not heavy, it's just a matter of can I get hold of it without damaging it. Yes, it is a good root system down in the pot, but as you can see, all of the roots on the top of the plant died back. It's just a tangle of dead roots. It's not affecting the plant's growth, quite honestly. The active roots, or the more active roots down in the pot, are more than sufficient for this plant. The fact of the matter is, though, it's eaten the media. It's developed such a large root system that there's almost more roots than media. And when it gets to that sort of stage, you need to get a lot of water on them because you haven't got so much media relative to the root ball to hold the moisture. So you end up watering more frequently, and you end up breaking the media down a bit quicker than you might have done otherwise. So after blooming, at the point of new growths, we will repot, and we'll probably at that point take the back end of the plant off, because we've actually got some leafless bulbs around here, and most of those are starting to lose their leaves. So that will give us a 2-year set of bulbs. Last year's, this year's that are currently coming into bloom, and then we'll be starting the next set, which in theory will be another 4, but it could be more. We'll have to wait and see. So well pleased with that, and this was bought because I liked the blooms and the fragrance. So there we go, Tahitian Dancer, done for the year. Well, as far as this series is concerned. Okay, next one up then is the Oncidium chrysomorphum. This was a gift from Zana, and it arrived totally rootless. Not one, not a light. So at this point back in March, it had not long been repotted, and quite a few stakes had to hold it in place because it had no roots down in the pot to help out. So it was just basically strapped in place. What it did have though was a nice new growth coming up at the front there in this view, and as a consequence of that new growth, I was expecting a root system to be generated. At this point it hadn't really sort of shown any signs of doing so, but it was going to come soon. It's one of those sort of things. The older leaves on the plant had stayed green, the pseudobulbs had stayed plump despite having no roots, so it had resources, it had reserves, and those were now being used to push up a new growth. So yeah, not bad. By the time we got to June, that new little growth was pushing on quite nicely and was now producing roots. So we did actually have a root system being generated quite nicely, and sort of not filling the pot, but not far off it. No sign of any spikes or anything like that, but I wasn't really expecting spikes. The plant itself was a division and it was in bloom when I got it, despite having no roots. So it had been taken off a plant in bloom. And the blooms lasted a reasonable while they were left on. So anyway, progress on this is pretty good. Expected from an Oncidium, growing quite vigorously. This one didn't take any notice of the heat. Leaves stayed a good dark colour despite having quite a bit of light, and the roots grew well, and everything was progressing quite nicely. I was sort of pleased. Right, by the time we got to September, our new growth was maturing very nicely. The bulb was forming, everything like that, and by now there was a pot full of roots. So it had a nice established root system, a maturing new growth that wasn't far off total maturity, of a good size, good coloured leaves, effectively from starting as a rootless plant. It's pulled on and grown into a very nice Oncidium species. Still no sign of any blooms, but from my point of view, I've got a good root system now through one growing season, nice healthy new growth, so I'm pleased with the progress of this plant. Because I didn't know what to expect, quite honestly. I've got very few Oncidium species, and quite honestly, when this one arrived, I'd never heard of it, so I had to look it up. But it has nice flowers, small, but plenty of them. So that's the thing we need to look forward to. Now, the Chrysomorphum has actually grown better than expected. That's all I can say. I mean, we start off with expectations. This was our little new growth at the beginning of the season. That's matured nicely, and in its infinite wisdom decided not to bloom. Most Oncidium types are at least starting to produce their spike as the bulbs mature, even if they're slow growers as far as spikes are concerned. This one has no sign of a spike, so it probably isn't going to, which is a bit of a nuisance because I thought it might. But during the season, we developed another nice new growth here that is pushing on quite nicely up through this part of the plant. So we've got a lead with a growth out here and another one here. This one will produce a new growth at some point down the line, but I suspect as a species it will probably have a bit of a rest and mature that growth properly. We started off with no roots on this plant. We now have a pot full of roots, so I'm well pleased with that. And that's reasonably fresh media. It can stay there for the next set of growths. So good progress on that one. Pleased on the grounds that it could have been a difficult plant to grow. I didn't know that. But certainly with the two new growths, one maturing or virtually mature and one pushing on, if ever it comes round to blooming, it's more than likely going to be a staggered blooming because the two leads are at totally different stages in their maturity. Almost mature, if not mature, and nowhere near it. So this one's going to take a while before that matures. This one will probably have started its new growth before this one matures. So it's always going to have that stagger, unless at some point down the line the plant gets split, in which case they'll develop in their own way, and because they're separated, the different phases of development won't show. So pleased with that one. It's done well this year. Right, this one was chosen because it was basically refusing to grow and had been for some considerable time. Lost most of its roots, my fault, being left in the pot too long again, and a wintertime problem basically because of the older media staying wet when it's cooler and the plant wasn't growing. So quite a bit of root loss. Nonetheless, it was repotted, I think, towards the end of the previous year, so, it was a matter of now hoping that it was going to grow. It had started a new little growth there on the left, but no sign of a new root system or anything. It was just sitting there. It wasn't really moving, so although there was a new growth, this should be a vigorous plant, and it still wasn't. It was still very tediously biding its time, but at least there was a new growth, so there was some hope that it may actually recover. So new growth progressing a bit, still no sign of a decent root system. Decision made at this point that this is its last season. It's got this season to recover and get some roots and, you know, mature a growth. Don't expect it to bloom, but it's been given long enough. It was decided here that irrespective of it not being potted too long ago, the fact that it still hadn't started a basic root system, it was going to get its media changed again. Because if it was going to be slow to produce the root system, by the time it actually started, I wanted the roots to go in new media so that they can stay there for plenty of time. That's if the plant's going to get kept. But at the moment we had some growth. I think there was an odd root or two, but nothing spectacular. And this should produce a very good, strong root system. That's what it had when I got it. Right, so the progress doesn't really show, but there was a little bit of root growth. We made the decision to repot, so that's been done. So it's now in new media, so any new roots that are growing, and there are a few, are going down into nice new media. The new growth has sort of pushed on reasonably well. It's still nothing like the size of the pseudobulbs that this plant is capable of producing. But I think it's done enough this year to be given a chance. Its main purpose now is to generate that root system and at least mature one bulb into a reasonable size so that it's got some reserves, and then start the whole process again with another new growth or two, preferably, add to the root system and become a more suitable plant to hang on to. So that was the goal for this one. Now this one has just about earned its keep, and it is only just. Skin of the teeth, I would say. This was our little new growth that was sort of pushing on through the season and didn't mature properly. It's quite a small pseudo bulb, but we've got a new growth pushing out here and another one round this side of the plant. So we've got two new growths now, and what we need is a root system. What we haven't got yet is a root system, but we do have some activity. I wouldn't say that was a brilliant root system, but it's some. So we do have the start of some roots on that new growth. I suspect we've got exactly the same under that new growth, but because it's in the middle of the pot, it's more difficult to see. So it gets to stay, but it really is only just. Those latest two growths now need to mature with decent sized bulbs. I don't care if they don't bloom, but they need to mature in a reasonable fashion and generate a root system under both of them. If they can do that, then the plant has a future. You listening? So you think I'm talking to you lot, don't you? No, I'm talking to you. You've had an awful lot of chances over quite a long period of time, and this was your last chance. You've just about come through the other end. So we'll see what the future brings. Okay, the Psychopsis Butterfly was bought on a whim, really, because it had decorative leaves. Not all Psychopsis have the patterned leaves, some of them are plain, and some of them have much larger, strappier leaves than this one. This seemed a more delicate looking plant, hybrid. So basically I hadn't had it long. It was bought towards the end of 2019, but I don't know when, I've lost the records. I decided, as it was a smaller plant, was probably not going to grow into anything massive, to give a Psychopsis a go on a mount. They do like to stay moist, but in periods when they're not actively growing, like during my winter, they don't like their roots to stay wet and soggy. So I thought, let's give it a go on a mount where I've got full control over how moist the roots are, how long they spend dry, if at all, but it gives me the control better than in a pot. Okay, we had a few problems with this one. It kept putting up new growths and they promptly rotted. So the new growth, it was just starting when I got it, never made it. They actually rotted. But then it started again. But they were growing incredibly slowly and there was still no signs of attempting a new root system. It didn't have very good roots. There are a few roots down in the moss on the mount. They're not growing, they're not branching, and it seems to be having trouble producing any new ones. So in effect, despite this being the warmer time of year when it should be happier, I mean, I've got the humidity, I've got the heat now, it should be a happy bunny. It's not. It's effectively stalled. And its attempts at growing new growths don't seem to be very successful at the moment. So I'm not quite sure where this plant's going to go. I mean, it's not dying, it's not unhealthy, it just keeps failing the new growths. So yet again, we were in a position where another set of new growths had gone. You can just about see one. It's on the left, there's a leaf sticking up that's bent, and immediately below it a bigger leaf at the base, and then the new growth that's just rotted is just there. And there was one each side. There was a sign of another one coming up the back, but what was happening now was there was some signs of root activity. Quite a feeble attempt, but a couple of new roots had started to grow out. One of them decided to grow up a pseudo bulb and head for the air, so that's never going to come to much. But one of them was down in the moss, heading downwards, so plenty of moss to grow into and should attach. So an attempt at putting some roots up, and yet another attempt at putting up new growths. So let's see what that's like at the end of the season. And the little Psychopsis looks like it's finally behaving, but it's still yet to be determined. The latest new growth up the top of the plant has not rotted, and I can see a root growing from the base of it at the very back of the plant. Now that's the farthest by a long way that any of the new growths have got, because it's actually forming a leaf, and the base of it looks sound. There's no blackness, because not long ago I took another one off, another rotted one out from this side, and what we've got is another root there, and we've got one that's not only gone down into the moss, it's come out the bottom. So there is an amount of root activity, although it is not much. This right hand side of the plant just doesn't seem happy. That's where it keeps pushing out a new growth in that area, and they keep failing. And the one that's coming up the back of the plant looks like it's going to make it. So we shall see, but given that this is not its happy time in the winter because of the cool temperatures and the short days, for that growth to have developed that far at this time of year is pretty good stuff. Could still do with a few more roots though. But at this time of year I don't expect much from this. I'll be happy if it stops growing and survives until the better weather comes. That'll do me, because it certainly has struggled this year, and it shouldn't be struggling with the heat, you know, and I do keep my humidity at a reasonable level. For this one perhaps it could be higher. Yay, competition time. The only Tolumnia I've ever had with 3 spikes at the same time, and this went into both the Bournemouth Orchid Society competition tables, show actually, and Wessex I believe, and it was in direct competition because it's in the same section as Lynn's Cairo Forum, which was also looking absolutely stunning at the beginning of this year. So they were sitting right next to each other, both mounted, and both with good spikes and good bloomings. Lynn won, yeah, bless her. Yeah, I think Lynn got the first, I got second. Because Lynn, I don't know whether she's actually fully qualified yet, but she is a judge, heading that way. She was wondering how the two would actually compete next to each other. Anyway, this is one of my better Tolumnias. It grows well, it's got a good root system, and the best ever 3 spikes at the same time. And we're now in June, and one of those spikes is still there. It's still actually there. You'll have to excuse the beeping, my loaf's just finished. Yay, fresh bread. Yeah, so the blooms on this had lasted an awful long time. There was branching involved. It wasn't the initial blooms. There was some branching going on. But nonetheless, a good performing Tolumnia, and it's one of my favourites as far as the blooms are concerned, just because of the combination of the actual colours. The deep red, the nice golden yellow, and the way the patterning works with the frill around the edge. It's just a really nice Tolumnia. And Tolumnia Peach does actually turn up for sale now and again, so it's one in the EU you might actually be able to get hold of. It's a good grower, seems to have the right combination of plants within its makeup to actually make it a good grower. So doing well in the middle of the season. Come the end of the season, the spikes are all gone. One would expect that. They were taken off when they were on their last legs. And since then we've got good growth coming out. There's a very, very strong new growth pushing out to the left there. One just behind it near the top, and there are several smaller ones in other parts of the plant. So at this point of the season, where we're coming to the days are sort of shortening, still good light, still good day length, everything's there for this plant to keep growing, but it is heading towards where it will slow up. So it's a matter of how far it will get before we actually get to the shorter days and the reductions in the temperatures. But nonetheless, a good plant, growing. It has grown well, it has bloomed well, and now it's growing again. So it's doing exactly as expected for a Tolumnia of this size. And the Tolumnia Peach is progressing. Some parts of the plant absolutely going mad and growing with huge vigour for a Tolumnia, and others a little bit slower. But there are several new growths on here. Several of the older growths that have bloomed have actually been snipped off in this area here. But we've got a good new growth coming up the back here. Let's get hold of it. And a lovely good strong new growth there coming out. That will probably come into spike soon. And then another one there. So we've got new growth on here, and as you can see from the base of that new growth, look at the sheer amount of new roots that have come out of there, and all headed down in and around the mount, because this one does have a very good root system. There's not a lot of moss there, more than on some of the others, but there's, you know, I mean, there's active roots right down here, you know, so it's a good root system. It's very well attached. The fishing line's still there, mainly to hold the tag on. But some of the roots have gone round the back as well. So up over the top. It's growing well. And whether we'll ever see 3 spikes at once again, I really don't know. But I suspect we might see 2. So progressing, but this time of year it will be growing slower than it would do, you know, in the height of the growing season. They don't like getting too cold, Tolumnias. Where they come from, they can get a little bit of a cool night now and again, but in the main, they're, you know, they're up the hotter end of intermediate, so they don't like getting too cold. And the short days does them in as well, you know, so it's not actively growing fast at the moment. It's ticking over, that's all I can say. But hopefully we'll get some spikes soon. If you think this was in bloom last February, and we're heading into December, so it hasn't got long. If it's going to bloom at the same time, it hasn't got long to get the spikes going, but we shall see. Right, that's that one. Now this Miltonia Queen Ann, it was decided to put it in the Project Orchids, despite the fact I was pretty confident this had a virus. It was being given one last chance to prove itself via these new growths that are showing, one towards the front, one out to the left. It was a matter of, do they develop okay, and do they bloom, and are the blooms okay? Because the previous blooming had quite distorted blooms, and there was just something not right about this plant. It never grew properly. But nonetheless, at the start of the season, we did have some new growths, and it was on its last chance. But nonetheless, I was prepared to give it that chance, and by including it as a project plant, we get the chance to watch the progress and the decisions being made. So this was possibly the start of the end. Right, so into the season, the new growth on the left had virtually stopped growing. So it had started and stopped. The one out towards the front was pushing on okay, and there was another couple of new growths that were trying to get going. So to all intents and purposes, it looked okay, as though it was trying to grow, but it wasn't growing properly. It really was not right. And to cut a long story short, it got put out of its misery. Basically, because of other plants growing larger and things like that, it was getting to the point where I was having trouble putting it somewhere where it didn't touch anything and keeping it separate, having to water it separate. So I made the decision not long after this point in the season, June, to actually dump it. So as far as this one is concerned, this is it. Okay, so the Brassia Santa Barbara was one of the two Brassias I got from Burnham's at their 70th anniversary, and hybrid this one. I'm not sure whether it's one of Burnham's own, but irrelevant. At this point, we'd repotted it. It was starting to grow a decent root system. The roots on it weren't too bad anyway, but it was growing more, and progress at the start of the season was as expected, new growths progressing. So one pushing on quite well out to the left there, with its pair of leaves formed, and growing roots at the same time, and then another little new growth off to the right, a bit behind the first one, but nonetheless there. So two leads heading off in opposite directions. One of them on the right there is going to be out of the pot, typical Brassia. The other one's okay, the roots went in the pot. So start of season, new growth, new root system being generated. Great. Okay, so by the time we got to June, our left-hand new growth had actually started to mature, was almost mature, and had pushed up a spike. So we were going to get blooms. The other new growth was lagging behind, and you can see now what I meant by climbing out of the pot. That new growth on the right-hand side has produced an absolute mass of roots, most of which never made it to the media, and some of them went down the outside of the pot. This is typical Brassia behaviour. Some say, well, mount it then. It still doesn't work. They still climb away from the mount and the roots still go aerial. So they're just the type of plant that you just have to, every now and again, you just have to take them out of the pot they're in and put them in another one and bury them down again, and get them bedded in. Anyway, we were looking forward to some flowers in the middle of the season, and a possibility of a spike on the second new growth out to the right, but no sign of a spike at this point in time. Right, coming to the end of the growing season now. Our growth on the right hand side, spike long since gone, matured, slightly smaller than previous bulbs, but nice and plump. The growth on the right hand side with the aerial roots, I think, suffered a little bit of a setback as a consequence of the original repot and a lot of the plant's strength being used up by the growth on the right hand side with its spike. So it's not matured as large and hasn't bloomed, and it's mature enough now that I'm confident it's not going to bloom. So it's done its thing this year, following a repot. It's not going to need a repot for some time now. So following its blooming, it's going to have a little bit of a rest, and then I would expect another pair of new growths, possibly 3, but probably 2, to start away again and start the whole process all over again. Now the Brassia's had a reasonable season. I won't say it's had a great season, it's had a reasonable season. It's set off in two directions. Only one of those directions produced a spike. The other one didn't. Not quite sure why, but it could be that some of its roots went aerial. But at the end of the day, this one matured and bloomed. It now has its next growth pushing on nicely, and you can see under there is the next set of roots for this lead. They will go down in the pot, and I may actually put some moss there to make sure the tips don't die back before they get in the moss, in the media. This side, however, not quite such a large bulb on this side, and it didn't bloom. And already many of the roots have not made it into the media, but some did. This has started its new growth as well. That's not going to get any roots into the media. So this has to be its last year in this pot. If I leave it, the trouble is if I take it out of this pot and put it in another one, what am I going to do? Because it won't go in one pot. The pot would have to be a foot wide, wouldn't it, to accommodate roots here and here, which means it has to be split. That knocks the strength out of it again. So it's a happy balance. Do I split it and get it in two pots where the roots can get straight down in the media, which would be good for the roots, or do I leave it in its pot whereby the roots won't do quite as well, but it will have the strength of the full-size plant? Because even these back bulbs around here have still got their leaves, yeah, and they've got roots underneath them as well. So there's some strength in the plant as it is. And as such, with these roots getting down into the media, these roots almost become irrelevant, simply because there's strength in the whole unit, especially with some additional roots coming on. So I'm going to leave it in the pot. I'm going to take that chance because it's in large bark. There's no moss in the pot or anything. I mean, it's got a good root system in there, so it can stay in there for another pair of growths. And then what we will do is down the line, which could be a year away, we will wait for it to be in this position again where the new roots are coming out, knowing now that when the new growths are about 6 to 8 inches long, the roots are going to start growing. So we can predict the repot time and the split next time round. So yeah, it's done pretty good, and I'm pleased that we had some blooms on it. I suspect both of the leads will bloom next time round, but they'll be staggered. They're offset, so we shall see. Anyway, that's the last one. Okay, so that was part one, the Oncidium Alliance, and I will see you over the next few days in part two. And just a reminder that the link to the playlist containing all the previous videos will keep being updated as I create the last few parts, ending up with a playlist of all of the videos for the 2020 Project Orchids. I mean, if you choose to watch those and see the progress through the year, you're welcome to do so. You can watch it in bits. You certainly don't want to watch it all at once. You could grow a beard while you're watching that, and that's just the ladies. Anyway, I'll see you in part two coming soon.